At Burrow 2:19 in the morning, on a ridge above the Absaroka Range in Wyoming, a single rifle shot broke the silence. The temperature was 18 below zero. The wind had been steady out of the northeast for 6 hours, and the snow covering the high slopes was the kind that did not move when the wind blew, packed and frozen into something closer to stone than to powder. The mountains did not care about the sound. They absorbed it the way they absorbed everything, without acknowledgement, without record. Down in the valley below the ridge, 9 men were going to die. They had known it for approximately 4 minutes. That was how long it had taken them to understand that the information they had been given before the mission was not incomplete. It was wrong. Not wrong the way intelligence was sometimes wrong, estimates off, numbers understated, terrain imagery outdated. Wrong in the specific and deliberate way that could only happen when someone had looked at a group of men and decided they were more useful dead than alive. Staff Sergeant Garrett Muse had done the count himself when the flares went up. His brief had said 18 personnel, light security configuration, oriented toward the eastern approach corridor. What the flares revealed was different. He had stopped counting at 44 because that was when the first round started coming in, and counting became less important than surviving. They were pinned against a granite face on the north side of the valley floor. The slope above them was too steep to climb under fire. The eastern corridor, the one they had used for ingress, was sealed by a blocking force that had moved into position during the 40 minutes it took the team to reach the objective. The western draw offered cover for maybe 60 meters before it opened into flat ground, with no concealment and excellent fields of fire for anyone on the ridge line above it. Muse had looked at all three directions in approximately 9 seconds and arrived at an answer he did not like. There was no answer, not one that kept all 9 of them alive. Private Theo Bassett was the youngest man on the team, 20 years old, from Bozeman, 40 minutes by road from the base of the mountains, where he was currently trying to make himself as small as possible behind a rock that was not quite large enough for the purpose. He had the particular quality of young soldiers who were good at the job without knowing yet just how good they were, a competence that was instinctive rather than calculated, which meant he moved well and reacted correctly and did not waste energy on things that did not matter. He also had the habit of carrying the heaviest loads without being asked and stepping aside in doorways to let others pass, which were not tactical qualities but were the kind of thing that made the men around him feel, without ever articulating it, that they were glad he was there. I was in the most exposed position on the line. He had moved there 20 seconds ago to pull a wounded soldier behind a rock shelf, and in doing so he had stepped out of what cover there was and into a gap that the enemy had been using as an aiming reference. He had not known that when he moved. He knew it now because 3 rounds had struck the rock directly in front of him, and the angle of the impacts told him exactly where the shooter was and exactly how limited his options were. He pressed himself flat and looked toward Muse. Muse looked back. In the red light of the flares still burning and drifting overhead, the look said everything that words did not have time for. Above the valley, on the eastern ridge at an elevation of 2,340 feet, a woman named Nora Weld had been watching Theo Bassett for 6 hours. She did not know his name. She had given him one in her own mind, the way she gave designations to everything she watched for long enough, a practical label that allowed her to track individuals through her optic without confusing them. She called him Kid. She had chosen the designation on the first hour of observation, when she watched him carry an extra 30 pounds of equipment up the initial slope without slowing the column, and then hand a portion of it off to a smaller man without being asked or acknowledged. She had been on the ridge for 13 days. The rifle in front of her was an M110A1 CSAS, the compact semi-automatic sniper system in its suppressed configuration, fitted with a Night Force Atagiar 525-56 optic and a Gemtech suppressor that reduced the sound signature to something that would not, at a distance of more than 200 meters, register as a rifle shot at all. It was the standard precision weapon system for Army Special Operations reconnaissance, chosen not for maximum range, but for the combination of accuracy, portability, and the suppressor's ability to make the shooter essentially invisible in terms of sound detection. She had cleaned it on day 6 and day 11. She had fired it 0 times. Her assigned load was a single magazine of 10 rounds. Standard configuration for a long-duration solo observation deployment where resupply was not possible, and weight management over weeks of movement mattered more than volume of fire. 10 rounds was not a combat load. It was the load of someone whose job was to watch and report, not to fight. She had accepted it on insertion without comment because the number matched the mission. And the mission, until 13 days later, had been observation. Her mission was observation, observe and report. Those were the words, and they were clear, and they had been clear for 13 days. And for 12 of those days, she had followed them without deviation. She had been inserted solo because Program Cold Watch inserted solo assets. The program did not officially exist in any budget document, any personnel file, or any training record that could be accessed through standard Army channels. It existed in the practical reality of certain operations that required extended ground observation without the signature footprint of a multi-person element, and in the judgment of the handlers who ran those assets and the assets themselves, who were selected for the particular combination of qualities that allowed a human being to be alone in a hostile environment for weeks at a time without losing the precision of their professional function, the ability to observe without intervening, the ability to watch without becoming involved, the discipline of the recorder rather than the actor. Her handler was Captain Edmund Sato. His last confirmed transmission had been on day 8. She had tried to reach him on day 9, day 10, day 11, and day 12. On day 13, she had tried 4 times. The channel produced static that was not random. It had a pattern, a cyclical structure that repeated every 40 seconds, which meant it was not equipment failure or environmental interference. Someone was generating it deliberately. Someone with access to the Cold Watch frequency architecture had decided that Nora Wells should not be able to talk to anyone. She had registered this fact on day 9 and continued doing her job because the alternative was to abandon a position that had taken 6 days to fully establish. In terrain, she had spent 13 days learning at a level of detail that no satellite imagery and no map could replicate. During an operation that was clearly moving toward the moment when her presence on that ridge would matter more than it had at any point prior. Abandoning a position when the situation was deteriorating was the correct response to many scenarios. It was not the correct response to this one. She had been reasonably certain of that on day 9. On day 13, with 44 armed personnel in the valley below her and 9 American soldiers pinned against granite with no viable exit, she was completely certain. She watched Theo Bassett move to pull a wounded man to cover. She watched him step into the gap. She watched 3 rounds come in from a shooter on the western ridgeline who had been waiting for exactly that kind of movement. She had the enemy's command element designated in her optic. She had identified the commander not by rank insignia or position in the formation, because at this range and in this light, neither of those was visible, but by behavior. He was the only person in the 44 who was not shooting. He moved between positions. He made gestures and other people responded. When he raised his hand, firing rates changed. He was the central nervous system of the engagement. Without him, what had been a coordinated encirclement would become a collection of individuals who knew broadly what they were supposed to do, but no longer had the timing to execute it precisely. She had him in the optic for 7 minutes. Her finger was not on the trigger. She had her orders. She also had a man in the gap with 3 seconds left. She made the decision that she had understood. Somewhere around day 8, she had already made. She just had not known yet what the circumstances would look like when it arrived. She breathed out. She fired. The suppressor handled the sound. What remained was a low mechanical report, directional to anyone within 60 meters, inaudible to anyone beyond 200. In the valley floor, 730 meters away, the commander took 1 step and then was not standing anymore. He went down without drama, without sound, the way the body went when the brain stopped sending signals before it knew it needed to. That was round 1, 9 remaining. The encirclement kept moving for approximately 6 seconds. Because the fighters who comprised it had been in motion and trained momentum does not stop for a single event. Then the coordination changed, not obviously, not all at once. There was a hesitation in the blocking force on the eastern corridor, a pause of perhaps 4 seconds in which the signal those fighters were waiting for did not come. And in that pause, the rhythm broke. And without rhythm, coordinated movement was just movement. Muse saw it. He had been watching the blocking force with the attention of a man who had no other options to watch. And when the pause happened, he felt it before he understood it. Kid was not dead. Muse exhaled once and got back to the business of keeping everyone else alive. On the ridge, Nora reloaded and did not move. She scanned the valley with the methodical attention of 13 days of practice, noting what had changed and what had not, calculating what the single disruption she had introduced would produce and how long it would last. The answer, she estimated, was between 4 and 7 minutes of degraded coordination. After that, whoever was next in the enemy's command structure would assert control and the encirclement would reconstitute. 4 to 7 minutes was not an extraction window. It was a breathing space. She reached for the tight beam radio on her left side and pressed transmit on the cold watch channel. She expected static. She got it. She tried the secondary channel. Static with the same 40-second pattern. She tried the emergency frequency that was not in any mission document, that Sato had given her verbally on the night before insertion and told her to memorize and never write down, that she had recited to herself every morning for 13 days as part of the same mental discipline with which she tracked wind speed and light conditions and the pattern of activity in the valley below. On the emergency frequency, there was no static. There was also no response. But there was silence rather than interference. And silence was different. Silence meant the channel was open. She waited. Below her, Muse had identified the same breathing space she had. He was moving his team along the granite face toward a narrow slot in the rock approximately 80 meters to the north. Not an exit, but a defensible compression point that would reduce the angles from which the enemy could engage them. Buying time, doing what you did when you had no good options, and time was the only currency left. She watched Kid move with the others. He was helping carry the wounded man now, taking the weight on his right side, adjusting his grip every few steps when the terrain shifted. He was still in the gap of being youngest and most useful and least cautious, which was a combination that was going to get him killed in this valley unless something changed in the next several minutes. She pressed transmit on the emergency channel. You're moving toward a slot that ends at a 14-foot drop. Stop at the first overhang. Silence. Then identify yourself. The voice was flat and controlled, the specific register of a man who was frightened and refusing to show it because showing it would cost something he was not willing to spend. She said, Elevation 2340. I have been watching your 6 for 13 days. You have 41 left. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. 41 what? Shooters. Another silence. She could hear faintly the sounds of the engagement continuing in the valley. Suppressed fire from the eastern element. Movement on the western ridge. Cold watch, the voice said. It was not a question. Stop at the first overhang, she said. Give me 4 minutes. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She moved her optic back to the valley. The enemy formation was reconstituting. She had been right about 4 to 7 minutes. It had been 4. There was a new focal point of authority emerging in the eastern element, a figure who was moving with directional purpose, making contact with other figures, beginning to reestablish the coordination that the first shot had disrupted. He was not the original commander in terms of tactical quality. She could see that in the first 30 seconds of watching him. It was someone who had been given a contingency role and was now in it, working from a plan rather than from judgment, which was slower and more predictable, but still functional. She read his pattern. She estimated where he would be in 45 seconds. She adjusted for the wind, which had shifted 2 degrees north in the last 8 minutes, and for her breathing, which she wrote down, as Sato had taught her, in the way of a metronome against which everything else was timed. She held her position. She did not fire. Not yet. 1 intervention changes an engagement. 2 interventions begin to establish a pattern, and a pattern can be reverse engineered into a position. She would not fire again until the calculus required it rather than merely supported it. What she did instead was watch the terrain with the attention she had been applying for 13 days, and what the terrain told her in the next 4 minutes was not reassuring. The western ridge had movement that was not reactive. It was not fighters responding to the loss of their commander. It was pre-positioned movement, deliberate and structured, that had been in place before the engagement began, that was continuing on its own timeline, independent of what was happening on the valley floor. She ran the calculation. 13 days of watching this terrain. The Western Ridge movement had a goal. It was not flanking the team in the slot. It was converging on a point farther north, approximately 300 meters beyond the slot, which was the natural collection point for anyone moving north out of the valley. The obvious ground, the place a trained soldier would identify on a map as the next defensible position after the slot. Someone had read the terrain the same way she had. Someone had positioned people at the conclusion of a movement before the movement had been forced. She pressed transmit. The slot is not the endpoint. After the slot, do not move north. Muse's voice came back. We have no north anyway. Drops too high. There's a ledge system on the east face of the slot, 12 feet down, goes horizontal for 40 meters before it connects to a gully that runs northeast. Silence. You've been on that face. Day 3, she said, in the dark. Another silence. She could almost feel him working through it. Then he said nothing more, which was Muse's way of agreeing to something he had not yet decided whether to trust. The sound of the engagement was changing. She tracked the change with the trained attention of someone who had been listening to this valley for nearly 2 weeks. There was a new element in the acoustic signature, a mechanical quality from the north that was distinct from small arms. Muse, there is a vehicle moving into position on the northern approach. It has a mounted weapon. You have approximately 6 minutes before it has an angle on the slot. Can you take it? She considered the question with the honesty it required. Not from this position. The angle is wrong, she paused. I can take the operator. That buys you 3 minutes while they reorganize. Take the shot. She had him in the optic in 11 seconds. 580 meters, elevated angle, the operator standing in the vehicle's ring mount, making final adjustments to the weapon's elevation. She read the wind. She read her breath. She fired. Round 2, 8 remaining. The operator went down. The vehicle stopped moving. 3 seconds later, the soldier in the passenger position exited on the far side and did not immediately return to the mount, which was the response of someone who did not know where the shot had come from and was making the logical decision to not stand in the place where the last person to stand there had fallen. 3 minutes, she said into the radio. Move to the east face. I will talk you to the ledge. She began to give directions. Not as instructions, but as landmarks, the specific language of terrain she had built from 13 days of personal observation. The crack in the granite at 12 feet, the overhang that looked unstable but was not, the place where the ledge narrowed to 18 inches and required moving sideways with your back to the rock and your face toward the valley, which was uncomfortable and exposed but navigable. The gully mouth, which was not visible from above and would not be visible to anyone who had not been to it. She talked them to the ledge. It took 11 minutes because of the wounded man. She watched through her optic as they moved, tracking Kid at the back of the column where he was still carrying weight and still watching the rear without being told to. She watched Muse at the front, moving with the efficient economy of a man who had been in bad places before and knew that speed and care were not opposites, but the same thing expressed at different scales. When the last of them was on the ledge and moving into the gully, she allowed herself 4 seconds to register what had just happened, not the tactical facts, the other kind. She had fired twice. She had broken the fundamental directive of Program Cold Watch. She had ended 13 days of invisible, unacknowledged, unrecorded observation by making 2 choices that would appear in no official record, but would be felt in every debrief, in every review, and every conversation that followed. 8 rounds remaining. 8 rounds to do whatever came next with. She folded the bipod, secured the suppressor, and began to move. The ridge she descended was not the approach she had used for insertion, because the approach route was the obvious route, and obvious routes were where people waited. She moved along the eastern face using the terrain breaks she had identified on day 2 as the secondary movement corridor. Slower by 8 minutes but invisible from the valley, approaching the gully from the north while the team moved through it from the south. So that when Muse reached the gully mouth and stopped because a figure was standing in it, that figure was already oriented away from him, watching the northern approach, rifle at a low ready. He said, "Cold watch." She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a moment in the darkness, the specific look of a man who had been told something he did not believe and was now confronting the physical evidence that he had been wrong. "How long?" he said. 13 days. "Alone?" "Yes." He did not say anything else immediately. Around him, his team was settling into the gully's natural concealment, checking each other with the reflexive thoroughness of people who had been in sustained contact and did not yet trust that the contact was fully over. Kid was at the back, sitting against the gully wall, finally still, the weight of what he had been carrying for the last 2 hours visible in the set of his shoulders. He was not injured. I was 20 years old and he had been in a position where he was going to die, and then he had not died, and his body was still processing the difference between those two states. Muse looked at her again. She was in the ghillie suit she had assembled over the first 3 days. Local vegetation worked into the base fabric. No reflective surface anywhere on her person or equipment. In the darkness, she was not quite invisible, but she was something that the eye would pass over without registering as human, which was the point. "Who else knows you're here?" he said. "One person, my handler." She paused. "I haven't been able to reach him since day 8. Muse was quiet for a moment. "Someone jammed your channel." "Yes. Ours too. Primary frequencies, all of them. I couldn't reach extraction coordination from the moment we hit the valley." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking because saying it was premature and would cost the team confidence they needed to preserve. But the thinking was the same. The jamming of her channel and the jamming of his were not independent events. They were aspects of the same decision made by the same person or persons for the same purpose. Someone had wanted both of them blind at the same time. She opened her mouth to say something about the route northeast. The direction, the terrain, the gully system she had mapped on day 4, and the exit point she had identified as the most defensible collection position within 2 kilometers. The words did not come out. Instead, she heard something. It was not a sound from the valley. It was not the vehicle or the engagement or the continuing movement of the enemy's reformation. It was a sound from the north, which was the direction she was watching, and it was the specific sound of a boot on packed snow, deliberate and controlled from multiple sources, spaced in the pattern of a sweep line. She looked north for 3 seconds. "We can't go north," she said. "That's the extraction corridor." "It was," she said. "Someone is already there." She turned back to Muse. In the near darkness, in the gully that was supposed to be the path out, she watched him do the same calculation she had just done, arrive at the same answer, and set his face against the weight of it. "How do you know?" he said. "Because I spent 13 days learning this terrain," she said. "And whoever placed those people north of us spent at least the same amount of time preparing this ground." She said it quietly because the team needed to hear it without the weight of what it meant. But she looked at Muse directly while she said it, because he was the one who needed to understand the full weight. This had been designed, not adapted, not improvised around their movement. Designed, the valley ambush, the jammed frequencies, the blocking position north, the secondary element already repositioning to seal the gully. 44 personnel in a terrain that the brief said 18. Every exit covered before they arrived. Someone had looked at the mission plan and built a response to it that anticipated not just the primary movement, but the contingency movement, the fallback, the natural instinct of a trained team under fire. Someone had read the mission plan, all of it. She watched Muse understand this, watched it settle into the part of his face where a man kept the things he was not going to say out loud, because saying them was a luxury that the next 6 hours could not afford. "Okay," he said, and then, after a pause that was exactly as long as the amount of time needed and no longer, "What do you know about the terrain to the east?" She had spent part of day 2 on the eastern approach, mapping the gully system. On day 4, she had found the ridge connection in the natural shelf above it. Separate days, separate explorations, building piece by piece the understanding of this terrain that now represented the only viable path out of it. She began to speak. The team listened. Kid looked at her from his position against the gully wall with the expression of someone who was very tired and very young and had just accepted, without drama, that his survival for the next several hours depended entirely on a woman he had never seen before who had apparently been watching him from a mountain for nearly 2 weeks. He nodded once when she described the eastern route. She did not tell him that she had been watching. She did not tell him that she had seen him carry the extra weight and step aside in doorways and move to cover the wounded without being asked. There was no operational reason to tell him any of that. And if she was honest with herself, which she had learned over 13 days of silence to be at a granular and unsparing level, there was something in the telling that she was not ready to do. Because the telling would require acknowledging that she had watched him for 6 hours and known from the first that he was going to be in that gap and had not warned anyone. Because warning anyone would have meant breaking cover, and breaking cover would have meant abandoning the position she was not supposed to abandon. She had made the calculation the way you made calculations in this job. She had watched, and she had waited, and she had told herself that the intervention would come at the right moment. And then the moment had arrived and she had made the shot and kid was alive. What she did not let herself finish the thought about, not yet, was the gap in that calculation. The moment she had not seen coming, the secondary element on the south face, the single shot from the south that she had heard as an acoustic event before she understood it as a casualty. The sound of a rifle that was not hers and was not Muse's team. She knew the sound's meaning as immediately as she knew anything about this terrain. The same part of her brain that had been running continuous assessment for 13 days had processed the acoustic signature and cross-referenced it against position and angle, and produced an output she had then had to carry while finishing the gully navigation and reaching Muse and beginning the conversation about routes east. She had not checked the roster. She did not have the roster. She did not know in terms of documented record whether the person who had been in the south position when that shot was fired was alive or was not. But she had been watching for 13 days, and she had spent 6 hours on Kid specifically, and she knew where he had been in the column, and she knew where the column had been relative to the south position when the shot came in. And the part of her that was not a tactical calculation knew, with the particular certainty of something that did not require confirmation, exactly what the roster would show when she finally saw it. She looked at the Astern Gully entrance. She described the route. The team prepared to move. Above them, on the ridge where she had spent 13 days, the wind picked up and covered the last of the flare light, and the valley went dark. In the north, the sweep line continued moving south, patient and unhurried, in the way of people who believed they were moving towards something that could not move away from them. They were wrong about that, but they did not know it yet. She led the way east. She did not look back at the south face. She would have time for that later. Or she would not. Either way, looking did not change the arithmetic. And she had learned 13 days ago, in the specific school of silence and patience, that the arithmetic was the thing you could not afford to look away from, no matter what it contained. Move east now. She moved. The eastern gully ran northeast for 240 meters before it bent and narrowed into something that was more cracked than corridor. A slot in the granite requiring single-file movement with both hands on rock and the rifle slung across the back. Nora had found it on day 2 while mapping the eastern approach in the dark. The first of several nights she would spend moving through terrain at hours when no one expected movement. She had not been looking for the gully. She had been systematically eliminating what the map said was there versus what her boots told her was actually there, and the gully was one of many corrections. She found the entrance now in total darkness and without hesitation. She went through first. The team followed in the order Muse established without instruction, the 2 wounded men in the middle where they would have the most support if the footing failed. Muse came last. The slot took 9 minutes. At the far end, it opened into a flat shelf of rock, naturally shielded on 3 sides by the ridge system above, exposed to the north but offering 400 meters of sightline before the terrain dropped away. Better than anything else within 2 kilometers. Nora had found the shelf on day 4 and confirmed its approach geometry on day 6, 2 separate reconnaissance visits that had given her confidence in the position from 2 different angles of entry. She had known it was here, and that knowledge was the difference between a position and a hope. She set the team into the rock features along the western edge and knelt at the northern exposure, rifle up, glassing the terrain below. The sweep line was still there. It had not accelerated when the team disappeared from the gully, which meant one of 2 things. Either the people running the sweep did not yet know the team had moved east, or they did know and were not in a hurry because they believed there was nowhere east that the team could go that was not already covered. She stayed with the scope and watched. The sweep line moved with patient confidence, not the urgency of hunters who had lost their prey. The steady advance of people who believed the prey had already run to where they wanted it to run. She filed that and kept watching. Behind her, Muse was doing what Muse did, moving through the team quietly, checking, adjusting, managing without appearing to manage. She had watched him for 30 minutes now, from close range rather than through an optic at distance, and the close-range version confirmed what the distant version had suggested. He was not a man who performed leadership. He was a man who practiced it as a physical discipline, the way a surgeon practiced economy of movement, because waste in his profession had the same cost as waste in surgery, which was that people died. He came and knelt beside her, not asking, not interrupting, just present, which was its own form of communication between people who understood terrain. "Sweep line," she said quietly. "I see it. They're not hurrying." A pause. He looked at the line for several seconds. "No," he said, "they're not." Neither of them said the rest of it. She appreciated that. She was about to return to scanning when she heard something from 30 meters to the south, from a rock feature she had noted on day 4 when mapping the shelf's perimeter. A sound so small it would have been nothing to anyone who had not spent 13 days learning the difference between what this mountain made and what something on it made. She was moving before she finished processing it, low and fast along the rock edge, rifle in both hands. She came around the south side of the feature from below, the angle no one covered because covering it meant lying on the slope, and found what she found. A cache, olive drab, waterproof container, the size of a medium backpack, secured under an overhang with a single retention cord. Army issue pattern, the kind used for pre-positioned supply drops in extended reconnaissance operations. Her supply cache. The one that had been placed on day 4 by the two-person support element that had accompanied her insertion, and then, she had been told on day 4, been pulled back due to mission parameter changes. She had been told this by Captain Sato. She had accepted it because Sato was her handler, and because parameter changes happened, and because there was no reason at that point to believe the information was anything other than what it was presented to be. She cut the retention cord and opened the container. The secondary radio was inside the support element's backup coordination unit, which should have gone with them when they were pulled back. It had not gone with them. It was here, secured in foam padding, the battery still showing charge. She turned it over in her hands. The authentication chip was missing. The small integrated module that lived in a slot on the underside of the radio housing, the chip that established the unit's identity in the encrypted communications architecture, the chip without which the radio could transmit and receive, but could not authenticate itself as a legitimate node in the Cold Watch network. Without authentication, any transmission it sent would read as an unknown contact. For 9 days, she had been trying to reach Sato on her own authenticated radio, but the channel had been jammed. What she had not understood until this moment was that the jamming was selective. Her authenticated transmissions were being blocked. But an unauthenticated transmission, something that looked like background noise or a foreign signal, might pass through simply because it did not register as a threat worth blocking. The support element had not been pulled back, or if they had left this here deliberately. Left it with the authentication chip removed, which was the specific action of someone who understood the jamming architecture and knew that an unauthenticated radio was the only thing that would get through it. 3 words were written on a strip of electrical tape inside the lid, in handwriting she had never seen before. Small, precise, careful. She's still up there. She read the words 3 times, the past tense of the verb, not is, was, written before whoever left this knew whether she was still alive, written by someone who had been watching the ridge the way she had been watching the valley. From a distance, with the patience of extended observation, someone knew she was here, had known since at least day 4, had not intervened, had left this instead. She brought the radio back to Muse. He read the words on the tape. He looked at her. She watched him decide not to ask the question that was on his face, because asking it would not change the next 6 hours and would cost energy neither of them had to spare. "The authentication chip is gone," she said, "but I can use it to transmit on a frequency that reads as background interference. It won't authenticate in the network, but it won't be jammed either." "Who are you going to call?" "Someone who's listening for exactly this kind of signal," she said. She keyed the unauthenticated radio on Sato's emergency frequency and transmitted 12 seconds of the Cold Watch recognition pattern, modified slightly in the way she had been taught to modify it when operating in compromised conditions. Then she stopped and waited. 40 seconds, nothing. A minute, nothing. She was reaching to try again when a voice came through. Female, controlled, tired in the specific way of someone who had been doing something difficult for longer than was reasonable. Cold Watch Asset, confirm your identifier. Nora gave it. A pause. Then, I've been looking for you for 9 days. My name is Rarick. Warrant Officer Sloan Rarick, I need your position. Something in the phrasing stopped her. The urgency was right, the identity check was right, but she had spent 13 days learning the difference between patterns that were organic and patterns that had been designed to look organic. She asked a question that was not in any protocol, a test drawn not from a manual, but from 13 days of watching people and understanding how they moved. What was the last thing Sato said to me before insertion? A silence, long enough to mean something. Then, I don't have access to that level of operational detail, which was either true or was the answer of someone who had been given enough information to pass a standard authentication check, but not enough to pass this one. Why do you need my position? Nora said. Because I'm trying to get you out. I need you to answer my question first. The silence this time had a different texture, not uncertainty, something being weighed. He said to memorize it and never write it down, Rarick said. That's what I have. The actual content isn't in any record I can access. Nora stayed with that. It was consistent with what Sato had actually said, and it was also exactly what someone would say if they had been briefed on the security protocol without having been present for the conversation. It proved nothing. It eliminated nothing. Give me a coordinate, Nora said. Somewhere I should go. There was a pause while Rarick worked through something. Then she gave a grid reference, a location 2 kilometers north and slightly west. A flat clearing Nora had identified on day 1 as the natural collection point for anyone needing helicopter extraction from this terrain. Nora knew that clearing from day 1. She had walked its perimeter on day 2 and understood its geometry. She knew the angle of the ridgeline above its southern edge. And she knew that the ridgeline had 3 natural firing positions that were invisible from the clearing itself and offered complete coverage of anyone standing in it. She had looked at those positions on day 2 and thought, this is where you would place people if you wanted to kill anyone who came here expecting rescue. I know that ground, she said carefully. I'll need 40 minutes to move the team there. Understood, Rarick said. I'll have coordination standing by. She released the button and set the radio down. Muse was watching her. He had heard both sides. You're not moving us to that clearing, he said. Not a question. No? Why? She told him about the ridgeline, about the 3 positions, about what those positions covered and what they waited for. She told him in the same level language she used for everything, because that was the language that allowed information to travel without the weight of what the information meant, slowing it down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She gave us the kill zone, he said. She gave us the obvious answer. Whether she knows what it is a different question. You think she doesn't know? I think the answer came too fast and was too correct, Nora said. Someone genuinely navigating a compromised situation would have hesitated differently. She hesitated on the things she should have known. She didn't hesitate on the coordinate. Muse looked north, toward the clearing he could not see from here but could place in his head. So either she's working against us, he said, or she's being used by someone who is. He turned that over. And the radio in the cache, whoever left it. A different someone, Nora said, or the same someone who has changed their position. I don't know yet. What she knew was this. The cache radio had been left by a person who understood the jamming architecture well enough to know that an unauthenticated signal was the workaround. That level of technical knowledge was not common. It was the knowledge of someone inside the communications infrastructure of the operation, someone who had access to how the jamming was being implemented, and therefore either implemented it themselves or was close enough to whoever did to understand its specific mechanics. She knew one other thing. The tape inside the cache lid. She's still up there, written as a fact to be discovered, not a question to be answered, which meant the person who wrote it had been watching the ridge, had confirmed her presence through their own observation, had left the cache and the radio and the message for someone else to find. The message was not for her. She was not supposed to find the cache. She had found it because she moved through this terrain in the dark and had been doing so since day 2 systematically. The message was for whoever came after. for whoever eventually made it to the shelf and found the question and needed to know that an asset was still in place. Rarick. The message was for Rarick, or for someone like Rarick, someone who came looking. She filed this and moved on, because the filing was complete and moving on was what the next 4 hours required. She got to her feet and went back to the team. One wounded man was ambulatory but slow. The other was not, and was being honest about it, which Nora recognized as its own form of professional courage. His name tag read alert. Fragment in the right thigh, not arterial, but enough surrounding tissue damage that the leg would not hold weight. Pale from blood loss. Alert in the way of a man who had decided that alertness was the contribution he could still make. I can move, he said. I'll need help. You'll have it, she said. She stood and looked at the team. 7 men who could move under their own power at speed. One who could move slowly, one who needed help. 8 rounds remaining in the M110A1 after the 2 shots fired in the valley. The unauthenticated secondary radio. Terrain she had spent 13 days learning from 2 to 6 separate visits per zone. Sweep line to the north. Kill zone to the northwest. She began to speak. She laid out the route east and then south toward a position she had identified on day 4 as the second best collection point in the area and confirmed on day 6 as viable, not a clearing. A natural shelf on the eastern face of the second ridge at 1,200 meters, accessible from the north by helicopter, if the pilot was willing to work the updrafts rather than fight them, shielded on 3 sides by rock faces that would require a ground assault to approach through a single-file chimney climb of 60 meters. It was not easy ground. It was ground that cost the attacker more than the defender, and that was the only kind of arithmetic that mattered right now. The movement took longer than she wanted. The terrain between positions was broken in ways that did not appear broken from above. Small ridges and frozen drainage channels and patches of wind, scour stripped to bare ice, offering nothing for a boot to grip. She moved at Olert's pace, deliberate and careful, and half the speed she would have set alone. She did not resent the pace. She had chosen to come down from the ridge, and that choice came with Olert. She moved accordingly. Muse moved up beside her during a halt, while she was glassing the approach from the west. You said your handler went dark on day 8, he said. Yes. Before day 8, was he the kind of man who goes dark without a reason? She thought about Sato, about the sandcast terrain models he used for briefings because he believed maps were lies that maps believed about themselves. About the way he modified protocols when circumstances required it and then documented the modification in writing before the operation was over. Because accountability in his view was not a punishment, but a professional discipline. He had said once, paper survives longer than memory, and the truth needs a longer lifespan than any single person. No, she said. So something happened on day 8. Something happened on or before day 8. Day 8 is when I stopped being able to confirm. Muse looked at the terrain, and the cache was placed on day 4. Yes. So on day 4, someone already knew that you were going to need an exit that didn't go through the normal channels. He paused. That's not a contingency plan, that's knowledge. Someone knew on day 4 that the operation was compromised, she said, not suspected, knew, and left you a radio instead of doing something about it. Because doing something about it required knowing where I was and what I had, and they couldn't get that information through the compromised channels. But they could place a cache, because the cache placement was handled through a separate logistics chain. Pre-insertion, Sato signing the order before the operation started. Someone who saw that logistics order knew the cache location. Muse was quiet. The halt had gone 2 minutes. She signaled and the team began to move again, slowly, east and south toward the shelf. She was watching the terrain ahead when Rarick came back on the unauthenticated radio. She had been expecting it. 40 minutes had passed since she gave the false timeline. Cold Watch asset. We have extraction assets positioned. What is your status? Still moving, Nora said. Terrain is slow. We need a current position. She gave a coordinate that was 200 meters northwest of her actual position on the far side of a ridge feature that blocked sight lines from both the clearing and the 3 firing positions above it. If anyone was triangulating on her transmission, they would be looking at empty rock. Copy, Rarick said. Keep moving toward the extraction point. Understood. She released the button. Muse was watching her. She keeps asking where we are, he said. Yes, that's not what a coordinating officer asks. That's what a targeting officer asks. She looked at him. I know. Doesn't much matter to us either way, he said. No, she said, it doesn't. They reached the base of the chimney approach to the eastern shelf at 04:47. The sky above the eastern ridgeline was beginning the first gray suggestion of pre-dawn. Not light yet, but the absence of the deepest darkness, a change that was more felt than seen. The chimney was exactly as she remembered it from day 4 when she had first climbed it, and from day 6 when she had climbed it again from the opposite direction to confirm what she had seen from below. 60 meters of angled rock face, not vertical, climbable without equipment at 3/4 pace, requiring both hands on rock for most of the ascent. Getting Olert up, it was going to be the hardest thing they had done since the valley. She went up first, quickly, to establish the top and verify the shelf before bringing the others. The shelf was clear. The rock faces on 3 sides were undisturbed, no signs of recent human movement. The northern exposure gave her a sight line across 2 kilometers of terrain in the pre-dawn gray that was getting slightly less gray with each passing minute. She looked at the clearing. Even from 2 kilometers away, she could see the ridgeline above its southern edge. She could see the 3 positions she had identified on day 2. In the current light, they were shadows within shadows, which was exactly what good concealment looked like from a distance. She was looking at 2 of those shadows when one of them moved. Not wind, not settling snow. Deliberate, controlled movement. The kind that made exactly the right amount of sound and no more. The movement of someone who had been waiting in a prepared position for long enough that they had learned to be part of the rock, and who was now adjusting because the timeline they had been given suggested that the people they were waiting for would arrive soon. She watched for 90 seconds. The shadows stilled, did not move again. She went back to the chimney head and began bringing the team up. It took 22 minutes. Olert came up last, with 2 men below him and 1 above, moving him up the face in a way that looked improvised and was entirely deliberate, learned from the specific accumulated knowledge of how you moved a person who could not fully contribute to their own movement without losing anyone in the process. He made it without sound, which cost him something she could see in his face at the top. You're done moving tonight, she told him. Tell me something I don't know, he said, and found a position against the rock that was both comfortable and offering a usable sightline back down the chimney. He was still working with what he had. She set the team into the shelf's natural features and came back to muse. The clearing is covered, she said. I saw movement in one of the positions above the southern edge. They've been there long enough to be settled in. At least 4 hours. Those positions take time to prepare in this terrain, and they're cold enough to have been in them since before we went into the valley. Muse looked at her. They were in place before the ambush started. Yes. I was quiet for a long moment. The gray in the east was becoming something closer to actual light. Not sunrise yet, but the world was beginning to distinguish itself from itself. Rock from sky, near from far. Someone set the clearing before we even left the base, he said. Yes. The clearing was supposed to be where we ran, he said. When the ambush started and we needed to get out, the natural move is to call for extraction. And when you call for extraction, someone gives you the obvious coordinate, and you go there. Yes. And whoever placed those shooters on the ridge above it would have killed us and called it a successful ambush. Yes. He exhaled. A long exhale, deliberate. The kind that was not about breathing, but about managing what was inside the breathing. How many people know about this clearing as an extraction point? It's on the standard mission support annexes for any operation in this corridor, she said. It's the only ground large enough for a landing zone within 2 kilometers. Anyone who looked at the mission planning materials would have identified it. And whoever gave the mission planning materials to the people who put shooters above that clearing 4 hours before the ambush started. The radio on her left side produced 3 short pulses, not a voice transmission, a coded beat, the cold watch pattern modified in the way she had transmitted it to Rarik, but returned now with 2 additional elements she had not put in the original signal. 2 elements that were not in any protocol she had been given. 2 elements that were in the variant protocol Sato had described verbally and told her to memorize. On the same night, he told her to memorize the emergency frequency and never write it down. She picked up the radio. She looked at it. She keyed transmit. She gave only the return authentication, the correct response to the 2 additional elements. The thing that could only come from someone who had been in that room with Sato when he gave the verbal briefing. The response came back in 8 seconds. One word: chimney. She looked at the radio. She looked at the chimney entrance below the shelf. She looked at the eastern sky, moving now from gray toward the first thin suggestion of something that might eventually become day. Muse came and stood beside her. Someone's coming up, she said. One of ours? I don't know, she said. Maybe both. She checked her remaining rounds, 8 in the rifle. She moved to a position covering the chimney entrance without advertising itself as a position. She settled into the rock. She waited. Below in the chimney, something was moving. Controlled, patient, a single individual who knew how to climb in silence and was choosing to make just enough sound to be heard from above. Because making that much sound was the specific announcement of someone who did not want to arrive unannounced in a position full of armed soldiers and a woman who had been on a mountain for 13 days and had been shooting accurately at ranges over 700 meters. She held the rifle at low ready. The top of the chimney produced a hand first, then a shoulder. Then the rest of a person who moved through the chimney exit efficiently and without drama, stood upright on the shelf and looked at Nora. They did not raise their hands or announce themselves or perform any of the theater of arrival. They simply stood and waited with the stillness of someone accustomed to being assessed, because being assessed was the nature of the work. She was perhaps 40 years old, no insignia. Her equipment was non-standard in ways that indicated custom rather than improvisation. The kit of someone whose operational requirements had been specific enough and sustained enough that standard issue had been modified past the point of recognition. She had the look of a person who had been running on something past exhaustion for long enough that the exhaustion had become the baseline. Not impaired, calibrated. She looked at Nora for 2 seconds. "You found the cash," she said, not a question. "Yes," Nora said. "The note wasn't meant for me." Something moved in the woman's expression. Brief. "I was counting on it being found on day 7. I left it on day 4. I mapped terrain at night. I found the shelf on day 4 and the cache the same evening." A pause. The woman looked at the team arrayed around the shelf, at Muse, at Olert against the wall, at the wounded men and the rest. "I'm Rick Eric," Shiva said. "Warrant Officer Sloan Rarick. I am not the person you were talking to on this radio for the last 2 hours." Nora looked at her. "Someone else has been using my identity and my authentication codes," Rarick said, "since approximately day 9, which is when your handler stopped being able to receive transmissions." Muse said, from behind Nora, very quietly, "And when did your handler stop being able to receive transmissions?" Rarick looked at him. The look was the answer. She said, "Captain Sato has been missing for 11 days. The shelf was very quiet. The eastern sky was getting lighter. In the north, the sweep line would be reaching the gully by now, finding it empty, beginning the recalculation that would tell them where the team had gone. They had time, not much, some." Nora looked at the woman who had climbed the chimney and delivered information that changed the shape of everything that had happened in the last 13 days. Not gone dark, not parameter changes, not handler communication issues. Missing 11 days, which meant that from day 2 of her observation assignment, Nora Weld had been completely alone in this terrain with no handler, no support, no exit, and no one at the other end of any frequency who was who they said they were. And someone had known that, had let it continue, had left a cache on day 4, the same day Nora had first mapped the shelf where they were now standing. She looked at Rarick. "Who left the cache?" she said. Rarick was quiet for a moment. Not hesitation. Assembly. Someone who found out about the compromise early enough to plan for this. Someone who could not stop what was happening but could leave a door open. A name. Another pause. The kind that preceded something that could not be unsaid. "The name," Rarick said, "is Vec." The wind came across the shelf from the east, cold and clean, and carrying with it the first light of a Wyoming morning that was going to be too late for some things and not too late for others. Nora held the name in her head. She had not heard it before in any briefing or any document, but she had heard it in a handwritten note on electrical tape inside a waterproof cash container, in handwriting she had not recognized at the time. "Ask Vec." She understood now that the note had not been a direction. It had been a warning, written by Vec himself, left for whoever came looking, because even the man who had built the architecture was trying, in the only way left to him, to leave a door open before the architecture consumed everything. "Tell me who Vec is," she said. Ririk looked at her, at the team, at the lightning sky above the eastern ridgeline. Brigadier General Harlan Vec, she said. He didn't just know about Cold Watch, he built it. He designed the program from the ground up, including the handler architecture and the solo insertion protocol and every procedure you were trained on. Nora said nothing. And for the last 14 months, Ririk said, he has been using the intelligence gathered by Cold Watch assets to support the operation you just survived. The eastern sky was properly pale now, the kind of light that showed everything and softened nothing. Somewhere in the chimney below the shelf, a sound started that was too organized to be natural and too familiar to mistake. Boots, multiple, moving fast, from the north. She looked at Ririk. Ririk looked back at her. They found the route, Nora said. Yes, Ririk said. Muse was already moving, gathering the team into positions that used the rock faces the way they were meant to be used. His voice was low and even and unhurried, which was the voice he used when things were most urgent. Nora moved to the chimney edge. She looked down. They were 40 meters below. 9 of them moving fast, the urgency of people who had run the calculation and understood that the team above them was not where it was supposed to be and therefore had to be here, on this shelf that was not on any map, found by some means that the people moving through the chimney had not anticipated. She raised the M110A1. She had 8 rounds, 9 of them. She looked at the first man in the chimney, who was moving quickly and had his eyes on the rock above him rather than the person at the top of it. She made the first shot count, not at the man, at the rock face 6 inches to his right, at the specific point where a 7.62 NATO round striking granite at that angle would produce a spray of rock fragment across a chimney 18 inches wide and send every person in it to cover without killing anyone. Round 3, 7 remaining. The shot was loud in the chimney, enormously loud. The echo came back from 3 directions. The movement below stopped. She pressed back from the chimney edge, out of the line of sight from below, and looked at Ririk. 7 rounds left, she said. Talk to me about Vec. Ririk was already moving to a position beside her, pulling a radio from inside her jacket. Something older. The kind of frequency architecture that predated the program and existed in a separate part of the communications infrastructure entirely. There's someone else involved in this, Ririk said. Someone who has been feeding me information for 3 weeks. Someone who knows Vec from the inside. Below the shelf, the chimney was silent. The 9 people in it were reassessing, and she estimated they would not stay still for more than another 90 seconds before whoever was leading them decided that one shot from above was a single shooter and pressed the advantage. The clearing, Nora said. The shooters above it. Are they Vex? Yes, the clearing was always the end state. Move the team from the valley, push them north, give the extraction coordinate through me, and close the trap. And when the trap closed, there would be no one left to explain what happened in this terrain. That was the plan, Ririk said. What changed? Ririk looked at her, a pause that had something complicated in it, the pause of someone who had been running a calculation for 3 weeks and was now at the moment where the calculation required them to say out loud what the calculation had produced. You, Ririk said, 13 days on that ridge without support, without contact, without anyone in the chain who was who they were supposed to be, and you stayed. You fired those shots and brought these men through the gully and up this chimney. None of that was in Vec's plan. His plan assumed that an isolated asset with no handler and no support would break protocol and try to extract on day 9 or 10. She paused. He did not plan for someone who stayed. Below the chimney, movement started again, faster now. Nora looked at the 7 rounds remaining. She looked at the chimney. She looked at Rarik's older radio, warm in the way of a radio that had been transmitting recently. That radio, she said. Who were you calling? Ririk looked at the radio in her hand, then at Nora. The person who knows Vec from the inside, she said. The person who left the cache, who wrote the note. She paused, and in the pause was the weight of something she had been carrying for 3 weeks and was about to put down. His name is Sato, and he has been alive for 11 days in a location 40 miles from this mountain, and he is the only person outside this shelf who knows where we are. The eastern sky was fully light now, the kind of light that showed everything. Below the chimney, 9 armed people were 20 meters from the top. Nora looked at the light. She looked at Ririk. Tell him to hurry, she said. She did not fire the next round into the chimney. That was the first decision, and it was made in the same part of her brain that made all decisions under pressure, the part that did not deliberate but calculated, running inputs against outputs at a speed that bypassed language entirely. 7 rounds remaining, 9 people below, a chimney 18 inches wide. One round into that chimney at the right angle against the right face would produce a debris pattern sufficient to stop the advance for 3 to 5 minutes. It would also tell everyone within a kilometer exactly where she was, because the echo signature of a suppressed 7.02 in a granite chimney was still distinctive at close range. And there were people above the clearing, 2 kilometers away, who were listening for exactly that kind of sound. She held the round. She moved instead. She left the chimney edge and went low along the western rock face of the shelf toward the natural overhang she had identified on day 4 as the feature most likely to create a concealed angle covering the chimney exit. It was not a prepared position. It was a piece of geometry that the mountain had made available, and she used it the way she had been using everything on this mountain for 13 days. Not because it was optimal, but because it was what existed and she had learned to work with what existed. Muse had seen her move. He adjusted without being told, pulling 2 men to the eastern rock face to cover the chimney from the opposite angle, establishing a crossfire that anyone emerging from the chimney would have to survive before they could effectively engage the shelf. He did this in 11 seconds. She was still settling into position when his team was already set. She looked at him across the shelf. He looked back. He did not nod. Neither did she. It was the acknowledgement of 2 people who had been operating on the same frequency for long enough that the gesture was redundant. Ririk was on the older radio, transmitting in short bursts, her voice low enough that Nora could hear the cadence but not the words. Whatever she was saying it with urgency that she was not letting reach her voice, because that was how you transmitted urgency over radio without transmitting panic, and Ririk clearly understood the difference. Below the chimney, the advance had stopped again, not retreat, reassessment. They had heard 1 shot. They did not know what the shot had hit or whether the shooter above still had ammunition. The leading element had gone to cover in the chimney itself, using the walls for protection, which meant they were no longer advancing but also not retreating. And the question of how long they would stay in that state was the question Nora was holding in her head alongside everything else. Olert's voice came from the eastern wall, quiet and even. "I have the chimney mouth." She looked at him. He had repositioned from his sitting place against the rock to a low prone behind a granite shelf at the edge of the overhang, his rifle resting on the stone, his pale face composed in the expression of someone who had made a decision about how to be useful despite everything his body was telling him. The leg was bad. She could see it in the angle at which he held his lower body, the careful stillness of a man managing pain by not moving the thing that hurt. His hands on the rifle were steady. "Hold it," she said, until something changes." He understood that. He held. The radio on Rarik's side produced a response. Rarik listened. Something in the set of her jaw shifted, the minor rearrangement of a face receiving information it had been waiting a long time to receive. She looked at Nora. "Sato has QRF assets coordinated, not through the standard chain. He's been running a parallel authorization through a contact at the Inspector General's office for 6 days. They've been waiting for a confirmed position." Nora processed the sequence, 6 days. Sato had been doing this for 6 days, building the parallel coordination while being held in a location 40 miles from the mountain, which meant he had access to communications from wherever he was being held, which meant he was not a conventional prisoner, which meant the people holding him had either allowed him access or had not understood that he had it. Hai had been a founder of Cold Watch and knew its administrative architecture better than anyone still active. He had used that knowledge to build a channel through the Inspector General's office that bypassed every structure Vec controlled. "How long?" she said. He said 20 minutes from confirmed position to asset overhead. Rarik paused. "He also said to tell you that the authentication chip from the cache radio is in his left boot. He carried it with him when they moved him. He wanted the chip with someone who could use it." Nora looked at the unauthenticated cache radio in her hand. She thought about Sato carrying a radio authentication chip in his boot through 11 days of captivity, not knowing if the person it was intended for was alive, not knowing if the cache had been found, holding on to it because the alternative was losing it and the chip was the only piece of equipment that could restore her access to the authenticated network. Paper survives longer than memory. He had applied the same principle to hardware. She set the thought down and picked up the immediate problem. Confirmed position meant transmitting a precise coordinate on a frequency that could be triangulated. She had her authenticated radio and the unauthenticated cache unit. The authenticated radio would be jammed the moment it transmitted on any cold watch frequency, but the jam was selective. If she transmitted on a frequency outside the cold watch architecture, it might pass through. She did not know the precise parameters of what was being blocked. The unauthenticated radio would transmit freely, but a QRF authorization running through the Inspector General's office would need authenticated confirmation to release assets. An unauthenticated coordinate from an unknown source was not sufficient. Sato would know that, which meant he had built the mechanism to receive and authenticate her signal through Rarik's legacy channel. She looked at Rarik. He needs the coordinate authenticated. Yes, I can't authenticate on a jammed channel. No. Rarik looked at her. But I can. My radio predates the Cold Watch architecture. It runs on a frequency allocation that was retired from standard use 4 years ago and reinstated for specific legacy operations. Vex jamming is targeted at current Cold Watch frequencies. He doesn't know this channel exists. How do you know he doesn't know? Because if he knew it existed, he would have used it to intercept my communications with Sato. And he hasn't because Sato is still alive. That logic held. She accepted it and moved on. Give Sato the coordinate, she said. She gave the grid. Rarik transmitted it. 11 seconds of clear signal, then silence. The response took 40 seconds, long enough that Nora had begun to construct the alternative plan, the one without air assets, the one that was entirely a function of terrain and 7 remaining rounds, an Olert holding the chimney mouth and Muse's ammunition states, and how long the shelf could hold against 9 people in the chimney who would eventually decide that the person above them was out of options. Then the confirmation came back through Rarik's radio. 2 words, clean channel, no static. Birds up. Nora looked at the chimney. She looked at Muse. 20 minutes, she said. He checked his watch. He did not say anything, but she could read the arithmetic in his face. 20 minutes was a long time. 20 minutes was also what they had. Alert, Muse said. Still holding. Hold. Below the chimney, the sound of the advance changed again. Faster, more distributed. She could hear it in the way the sound came back off the rock walls. 2 points of source rather than 1, which meant they had split the element, one group continuing up the chimney and a second group moving along the outside of the cliff face, looking for an alternative approach. There was no alternative approach. She had spent day 4 and day 6 confirming that from both above and below. The cliff face was sheer for 40 meters on either side of the chimney, granite that offered no purchase and no traverse. The people below did not know that. They would spend time finding it out, and time was the only thing that mattered in the next 19 minutes. She pressed back against the overhang and ran the numbers one more time, the way she had been running numbers for 13 days, not because she enjoyed it, but because the numbers told her things that intuition did not. 9 people below, 7 rounds, 8 men on the shelf, 2 of them degraded. Rarik as a variable she had still not fully resolved. 19 minutes, a clearing 2 kilometers away with 3 positioned shooters who would hear the extraction assets coming before they arrived and would make a decision about what to do with that information. She pressed transmit on her authenticated radio, not on a cold watch frequency, on a frequency she had memorized on the first day of her training 18 months ago and been told to use only when every other option had been exhausted. The program director's direct channel, a frequency so rarely used that there was no jamming architecture built against it because no jamming architecture had ever needed to account for it. She gave her identifier. She gave the grid of the clearing. She gave the grid of the 3 positions above the clearing's southern edge. She gave the bearing and estimated range from the shelf to each position. She was not requesting action. She was creating a record. She was transmitting a documented, authenticated, time-stamped account of the positions to a channel that fed directly into a server that was not under Vex authority or anyone in his chain of command. She was writing it down because paper survived longer than memory, and the truth needed a lifespan longer than any single person. If she did not come off this mountain, the record would exist without her. She released transmit. She moved back to the overhang. The chimney produced a sound that was different from what had come before. Not movement. The specific absence of movement that preceded a decision. The silence of people who had made up their minds. She looked at Olert. He had heard it too. His hands shifted on the rifle, not tightening, just readying. The adjustment of someone who had been holding a position for a long time and was now changing the quality of the hold from sustained to immediate. They came up fast. The first man cleared the chimney exit in a controlled burst of movement, turning immediately to cover the shelf interior rather than looking up. Because looking up was what you did if you expected fire from above, and he had decided there was no fire from above. He was wrong about that, but he moved before Nora could correct him, going low behind the first rock feature he reached and calling back into the chimney. Muse fired twice from the eastern face. Not at the man, at the rock in front of the man, the specific technique of marking a position, telling someone without killing them that they were in a field of fire and their options from this point forward were limited. The man went flat, stopped. The chimney was quiet again. Muse's voice, calm and unhurried, carrying across the shelf with the particular authority of a man who was not performing authority, but simply speaking from it. You are on a shelf with one-to-one exit. We have your exit covered. The people below you cannot reinforce you faster than we can respond to them. You have about 16 minutes before this situation changes in a way that removes your options entirely. I am giving you the opportunity to use those 16 minutes well. Silence. Then, from the man behind the rock, who are you? The wrong people to have come up this chimney for, Muse said. But that's correctable. Stay where you are. She heard the man transmit something into his radio. She could not hear the response, but she could read the quality of the silence that followed. And it was the silence of someone who had been given information that rearranged the problem they were in. She looked at Rarick. Rarick was listening to her own radio. Her face was doing something careful. The expression of someone receiving information piece by piece and holding each piece until the whole assembled. She looked up at Nora. Vec has ordered the clearing element to reposition. He knows the extraction is coming and he's moving them to intercept. How far? He's pulling them south toward the chimney base. He's giving up the clearing as a kill zone. He's repositioning everything toward the shelf. Nora thought about that for 3 seconds. Vec giving up the clearing meant Vec had concluded that the extraction assets would not be able to use the clearing because he was closing the distance to the shelf. He was compressing the problem. Fewer locations to monitor, all resources on one point. It was tactically sound. It was also the kind of decision that told her something important about where his confidence was coming from. He still believed he had time to close before the birds arrived. He had information about the extraction timeline that suggested he believed he did. His timeline, she said to Rarick. He thinks he has more than 20 minutes. Rarick understood immediately. He's intercepting transmissions. Not all of them, not Sato's channel, not yours, but something. She ran backward through every transmission in the last 2 hours. Her authenticated radio. Rarick's legacy channel, the unauthenticated cache radio. The program director's direct channel, used once, 30 seconds ago. 30 seconds ago, the only channel she had used that Rarick had not confirmed was outside the jamming architecture. The program director's direct channel, which was so rarely used that she had not considered whether it was within Vec's technical reach. Vec had built Cold Watch. He had designed his communications architecture. He might know channels that standard jamming plans did not account for. If Vec had heard that transmission, he had heard the authenticated identifier. He had heard the grid of the clearing. He had heard the grid of the 3 positions. He had heard a time-stamped, documented record of everything she had seen. And he now knew she had created it. He heard my last transmission, she said. He knows I filed the record. He knows that if I come off this mountain, that record becomes evidence. He's not repositioning to intercept the extraction. He's repositioning to make sure I don't get on the aircraft. Rarick looked at her. The look had something in it that was not fear and was not resolve and was the thing that existed between those 2 states. The thing that people carried when they understood the situation completely and had not yet finished deciding what to do about it. Muse had heard all of it. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the chimney, at Olert on the eastern wall, at the 8 men he had left, and what they represented in terms of capability. in ammunition, and the specific determination of people who had survived something they were not supposed to survive and had not yet finished surviving it. He said, very quietly, to the shelf at large rather than to anyone in particular, 12 minutes. 12 minutes to extraction. 3 positions of Vex clearing element, now repositioning toward the chimney base. 1 man from the chimney advance, currently behind a rock on the shelf, holding position. 8 people still in the chimney below, 7 rounds in the M110A1. She looked at those 7 rounds the way you looked at something that had a finite number of uses and required you to choose each use correctly. She thought about Sato in his boot, carrying the authentication chip through 11 days of captivity. She thought about Rarick climbing the chimney with information she had been holding for 3 weeks, waiting for the moment when the person who could use it was in a position to receive it. She thought about Muse moving his team into position on the eastern face in 11 seconds without being told, and Olert holding the chimney mouth on a leg that should not have been doing anything, and the man behind the rock on the shelf who had transmitted something into his radio and then gone quiet in the way of someone who was reconsidering his employer. She thought about Theo Bassett from Bozeman, 40 minutes from the base of these mountains. She thought about the 6 hours she had watched him through the optic and the name she had given him that was not his name. She thought about the shot she had not taken fast enough and the shot from the south of face that she had heard as sound before she understood it as loss. She thought about what it meant to be the person who stayed when every reasonable calculation said to go. The sound from the north changed. Not chimney sound, not mountain sound. The specific mechanical rhythm of rotary wing aircraft at distance, still below the ridgeline but rising. The approach of something large moving with the urgency of a transmission that had said birds up and meant it. She looked at the sky above the northern exposure. Nothing visible yet. 60 seconds, maybe 90. Below the chimney, the 8 people in it heard it too. She knew because the quality of the silence changed again. The specific rearrangement of people in a confined space who had just received information that altered every calculation they had been running. The man behind the rock on the shelf said, loudly enough to be heard below him, "Stand down." Silence from the chimney. I said, "Stand down." His voice was different now. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to enforce it. "It's over. Stand down." Nora looked at Rarick. Rarick looked back at her. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying. The first aircraft came over the northern ridgeline at an angle that told her the pilot had done exactly what the terrain required, using the updrafts from the eastern face rather than fighting them, coming in low and banking to put the aircraft's belly toward the shelf, while maintaining the rotor clearance that the surrounding rock walls demanded. It was precise flying, the kind that required knowing what you were flying into before you arrived. Sato had given them good coordinates. The aircraft held in a hover 6 feet above the northern exposure, while the crew chief established communication with Muse and began the extraction, accounting for Olert's leg and the 2 other wounded in the physical condition of people who had been moving through broken terrain at altitude in extreme cold for most of a night. Muse coordinated it with the same economy he brought to everything. Wounded first, then the rest of the team in the order of operational priority, which meant Muse himself was last in the line. He looked at Nora before he went. She was standing at the chimney edge. The man who had told his team to stand down was still behind his rock, and the 8 people below were still in the chimney, and none of them were moving. She had her rifle at low ready and 7 rounds chambered, and she was doing what she had been doing for 13 days, watching and holding the position until the position no longer needed to be held. Muse said, "You're coming." Not a question. "After you," she said. He went. She watched him go, and she kept the chimney covered, and she thought about the record she had transmitted and whether it would be enough. She thought about what Rarick had said. He did not plan for someone who stayed. She lowered the rifle. She turned and went to the aircraft. Rarick was already inside. Olert was inside, his legs stabilized by a medic whose hands moved with the assurance of someone who had done this in aircraft before and had stopped being bothered by the noise and the motion and the cold air coming through the open door. The rest of the team was inside. Muse was at the far end of the cabin, watching her come. She climbed in. The crew chief pulled the door. The aircraft lifted. She did not look down at the shelf as they rose. She looked north through the crew chief's open position at the terrain below the Absaroka Range as it became smaller and then smaller again, and then the kind of small that terrain became when you were high enough above it to see its shape rather than its detail. The valley where the ambush had been, the gully, the eastern shelf, the clearing 2 kilometers south of the shelf, where 3 positions had been set to kill everyone who came to what was supposed to be a rescue. Those positions were empty now. Vec had pulled them to the chimney base, arriving 4 minutes after the aircraft lifted. 4 minutes. The arithmetic of how close things had been. She held the M110A1 across her knees, 7 rounds still chambered. She had fired 3. She had not fired 7. Ririk sat across from her in the aircraft cabin. The older radio was in her lap. Her face had the exhausted quality of someone who had been holding something up for a very long time and had just been told she could put it down. She had not put it down yet. The habit of holding was harder to release than the thing itself. Nora understood that. The aircraft banked north, and the mountains fell away, and the sky above Wyoming was the specific flat gray of a winter morning that had been awake longer than it wanted to be. The kind of sky that gave nothing and asked for nothing and simply continued being the sky with the particular indifference of things that would outlast everything happening below them. She thought about the review that was coming, the debrief, the formal assessment of Program Cold Watch and the conduct of its assets in compromised conditions. She thought about the people who would be in the room for that review and whether those people were the same people who had built the architecture that Vec had used. She thought about Sato, who had transmitted authentication information from captivity and carried a radio chip in his boot and built a parallel authorization through the Inspector General's office over 6 days, doing the work that the system was supposed to do through a channel that existed outside the system because the system had failed and the work still needed doing. She did not sleep. She watched the terrain below and thought about the record and what it meant to have stayed when every calculation said to go. Sato had framed it in training not as courage, but as professional judgment. The assessment that your presence in a position was worth more than your absence from it, made from inside the position rather than from a distance. He had been right. People were alive because he had been right. She also thought about Theo Bassett. She would think about him for a long time. It was the cost of the calculation, the part that did not appear in any record, and that no debrief would surface, and that she would carry in the way you carried things that could not be put down, not forever, but for the foreseeable future, which was all the future she could currently see. The aircraft touched down at a forward operating facility, the flat geometry of a place that existed because a location required a presence. Medics came forward. Muse spoke to the facility commander in the flat, precise language of a man who understood that information served a purpose beyond the conversation. Olert was transferred to a stretcher, his hands releasing the rifle only when someone took it from him directly. Ririk walked towards the operations building without looking back. The older radio was still in her hand. She would make calls from that building, the kind that preceded records going where records needed to go. Nora stepped out last. Her boots touched ground that was flat and not a mountain. She stood still for a moment. A staff officer approached. Debrief request. The formal language of institutional process, polite and inexorable. She said she would be available in 30 minutes. She said it in the tone that made clear 30 minutes was not a negotiation. She walked to the facility perimeter, where the cleared ground ended and Wyoming terrain began again. And she looked north at the Absaroka Range on the horizon. Peaks that were entirely themselves and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened among them in the last 13 hours. She held the M110A1 in her right hand. She looked at the mountains for 90 seconds, long enough to confirm they were still there, long enough to complete something she did not have a name for. Then she turned and went inside. In the weeks that followed, the investigation ran along multiple tracks at different speeds. The Inspector General's office received the authenticated file and forwarded it to a review body outside the regional command structure. Vec submitted retirement paperwork 11 days after the extraction. The criminal referral arrived 2 days after that. Whether that referral would travel the full distance between pending and resolved was a question that would take months, answered in rooms Nora did not have access to. Sato was debriefed. The document ran several hundred pages. He found the outcome predictable, which was different from finding it acceptable. Ririk was reassigned. The assignment was framed as a commendation. She accepted it because the work needed to continue. Cold Watch was suspended pending program review. Nora submitted a written statement documenting everything from insertion through extraction, including the jamming architecture, the day-by-day discovery of terrain features that had ultimately proven decisive, and the authentication chip Sato had carried in his boot for 11 days. She did not know what the panel would do with the statement. She knew the statement existed. She learned Theo Bassett's full record through Muse, who obtained it through channels that were not formal but produced actual information. Bassett had been in the regiment 14 months. Born in Bozeman, described in his evaluations as instinctive and reliable. The kind of soldier you want on your left. 20 years old, the south-faced secondary element had caught him before Nora had eyes on the flanking position. The official record noted his action in moving to cover a wounded soldier before the flanking element engaged. She read that line 4 times. She wrote his family a letter. 3 versions were wrong in ways she understood. The 4th she wrote in 20 minutes without stopping and sent before revising, because delay was its own kind of failure. The letter said their son had moved to cover a wounded man without being asked and shown the kind of instinct that could not be trained into a person but only trained out, and that it had not been trained out of him, and that his absence was the specific shape the night had taken and would keep. She did not know if it was the right letter. She knew it was the true one. Muse found her 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday when Wyoming's flat gray had finally cleared. He sat down. His silences were the space he used to ensure what followed was worth the language. The review panel has a preliminary finding, he said. They're recommending the program continue. Structural reforms, handler redundancy, multi-layer authentication, an independent review process operating outside the program's chain of command. A pause. It's not everything. No, but it's not nothing. No, she said, it's not nothing. He looked at the table. The officer who signed the brief that said 18, a colonel named Harwick, retirement papers 4 days ago, criminal referral pending. She held the word, pending. She knew the distance between pending and resolved. She also knew Harwick's name was in an authenticated timestamp document in a database that no one with an interest in its disappearance controlled. The record exists, she said. Yes, then it will exist until it matters. That is all records can do. He said, I put in a request, specific asset attached to my element. Pending review conclusion, provisional, 90 days. He paused. Approved this morning. Through the window, the Wyoming sky was simply blue, offering itself as a fact rather than a symbol. 90 days, she said, to start. She looked at the mountains, the Absaroka range in winter light that was finally, after weeks of gray, honest about what it was capable of. Alert, she said. Physical therapy Monday, the leg holds. 6 weeks, maybe 5 if it's alert. The rest of the team, all present, he said. She held that. Then I'll need your communication protocols. I'll walk you through them. I have opinions about radio discipline. I'd be surprised if you didn't. Something moved across her face in the vicinity of a smile. It held there for a moment, unfamiliar, not unwelcome. The expression of someone not accustomed to the feeling and still working out whether it fit. She picked up the mission folder for the 90-day attachment. She looked at the intelligence confidence level listed in the brief. High. She would read it carefully. 3 times. She would note everything it did not say and everything it assumed without documenting. She had learned that much on 13 days of a mountain that did not care whether she survived it, only whether she was paying enough attention to deserve to. She would not unlearn it. Somewhere in the authenticated database, the record still existed, time-stamped, irrefutable, with Vec's name in it and Harwick's name in it and 3 grid coordinates that no amount of retirement paperwork could untransmit. Somewhere in the Absaroka range, the shelf above the eastern chimney received the afternoon light on its granite face and did not record what had happened there. Because granite did not record, it simply endured. The way mountains always did. The way the work always did, when the people who did it were the kind who stayed. And somewhere in a Bozeman address she now knew by heart, a family had a letter. She did not know what it meant to them. She knew it was the true version. She knew the record existed. She knew that staying, when every calculation said to go, was not the end of the story. It was where the next one began.